You can have writers, but if no publisher, then no stories will be made available. I'm not a young man trying to make my first million, or I'm not trying to make a career. Why not do something that is meaningful, that can leave a good legacy if it's successful?
Edmund Wee is one of the biggest champions of Singapore literature, or SingLit. The psychologist turned journalist turned design agency founder started Epigram Books in 2011. The imprint has produced more than 350 fiction and non-fiction titles. In 2015, Mr. Wee launched the Epigram Books Fiction Prize in search of the next big Singaporean novel. I'm Sumiko Tan, Executive Editor of the Straits Times. I'm meeting Mr. Wee for lunch at Dolcetto, a bistro at the Conrad Singapore Orchard. Over pizza and pasta, he tells me that the country needs to have its own stories. He also shares the book that changed his life. How would you define SingLit?
I have a very different definition than the Singapore authorities. I define SingLit as stories about Singapore.
How do they define it?
They define it as stories about Singapore, but also stories by Singaporean, which I don't agree. So if you're a Singaporean and you decide to write a story set in Japan and it's all about the Japanese people, or you write a story that is set in England and it's all about English people, it's got nothing to do with Singapore. I don't consider that as SingLit. Yes, he's a Singaporean author. Singaporean may be famous, may be successful, but if the story is not about Singapore, why do you call it SingLit? The definition is SingLit, Singapore literature. It's not Singapore writers. And if you have a foreigner who writes about Singapore, I will still call it SingLit. So the definition should be about the content and not the author.
So what has been like the public reaction to SingLit?
I think there is a realization that there is SingLit. In the past, they never talk about it. There are people who are very conscious that you should support SingLit. So when I started my bookshop, right, in URA Centre in 2019, it's the first bookshop in Singapore to sell only SingLit. You would think that if you open a bookshop, you usually want to sell as many books as you can rather than restrict yourself, right? Because niche is for a small country is very difficult. But I was making money. People came because they said, oh, this is a bookshop selling SingLit. I want to support SingLit. I want to know what is SingLit. I want to buy. So we had enough business not to lose money.
I mean, the book business is so difficult. So why are you a champion of SingLit?
Why not? Literature is so important. Countries and people coalesce around famous characters and famous novels. You know, if you are in England, you talk about Romeo and Juliet, you talk about Pepys, you talk about Oliver Twist. When you have a novel that is read by everyone in the country, everyone in that country has some common understanding about characters and about values and all that. In Singapore, we don't have this, and I think it's important that these stories are told. And if there's no publisher, there's no stories. It's the whole ecosystem of writing and publishing. You can have writers, but if no publisher, then no stories will be made available. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not a young man trying to make my first million, or I'm not trying to make a career. Why not do something that is meaningful, that can leave a good legacy if it's successful? So do what I can.
The book that most influenced you, what would that be?
When I was 19 years old, I read a book called The Fountainhead, written by Ayn Rand. The novel itself inspired me to live a life very much like the protagonist in the novel, who was an architect, very idealistic. And when his building was not built to his specification, he decided to bomb it. And I went to jail for it. When I read the novel, I felt it's important to live a life like this, what this person had done, not to the extreme of bombing a building, but the belief that what you do is right. You should try to live a life that has meaning, that leaves a legacy, that is true to your belief. When I read it at a very young age of 19 years old, I said, wow, this is how one should live a life. And I think it gave me a direction to my own life.
What's the most enjoyable part of doing what you're doing?
I think the most enjoyable part is really discovering all these stories and then bringing them into print. Really, when you read a great manuscript, it's so exciting to say, oh my God, there's this great story. And then you can't wait to put it out, right?
So in your view, what has been the greatest piece of SingLit you've come across?
The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chai.
That, I mean, it's more like a comic novel?
Yeah,
what do you
it's
say?
a graphic novel,
graphic
but it's still fiction.
Right. What's your view on Crazy Rich Asians?
I don't think it's a great novel, but it's written in a very entertaining and readable way. And I'm glad it became successful. It's always nice to read stories about people you do not know about. I came across somebody who told me about somebody who spends the weekend on Friday night, they fly to Paris to catch a show and have dinner and then fly back the next day. I says, oh my God, you mean there are people like that? And then I realized that there are people like that. So these are the super rich. So it's good to get an insight. I don't know how accurate it is because I wouldn't know about the life of the super rich, but I think it was an entertaining book.
Would you have published it?
Yes, of course I would have published it. I'm not a publisher who say, oh, I must only publish books about the middle class or the poor. No, of course I'm happy to publish a book about any aspect of or any strata of Singapore society.
Is there a novel inside you?
Is there a novel? Yes, but I don't think it will ever come out.
What?
Being the perfectionist, I don't think I can write. I have this dilemma. If I were to write a novel, I would spend between 3 to 5 years writing it. You first write it, will take some time, and then you revise it. That means I would produce one book in 5 years. But if I'm a publisher, I can produce 50 books in 1 year. And I think in 5 years, I will do 250 books. And I think it's more important for those 250 books to be out there than for my one book to be out there. So between being a writer or an author and being a publisher, I feel that it's more important that I remain a publisher.
Thanks very much for having lunch.
You're welcome.
We love hiring people with something on the side. What else do you do beyond work? If you tell me that you like cafe hopping, I will never hire you. You're too basic for me.